The sun had just begun to rise over the rolling Texas hills when Hank Sullivan stepped out of his truck, his boots sinking softly into the dusty ground of the rural auction yard. The morning air carried the familiar scent of hay, old wood, and the quiet promise of another long day. Hank, with his worn denim overalls and weather-edged hat, looked every bit the seasoned rancher he was. Yet there was something heavier in his posture, a quiet exhaustion carved by years of solitude. As he walked along the wooden pens, he wasn't searching for anything in particular, just letting the morning fill the empty spaces inside him. But then he saw it. Tucked away in the farthest pen stood a thin, golden-coated colt, its long mane tangled and dull, its ribs faint beneath the soft light. The little horse lifted its head, meeting Hank's gaze with eyes far too expressive for its frail body. There was fear there, yes, but also something like hope, something that made Hank pause. He stepped closer, and the colt didn't retreat. Instead, it shifted its weight awkwardly, as if trying to stand taller for him. For reasons he couldn't explain, Hank felt the pressure of connection hit him in the chest. The auctioneer approached with a half-hearted shrug. $15 for that one. Folks say he was abandoned out past the ridge. Nobody's wanted him. Hank ran his rough hand along the top rail of the pen, his mind racing. $15 wasn't much, but lately even small purchases mattered. Still, the colt's soft breath, the way it leaned slightly toward him, felt like a quiet plea he couldn't ignore. With a sigh that held years of unspoken memories, Hank pulled out the money and handed it over without another word. He led the colt, whom he would soon call Buck, into the fenced ring beside his barn. Morning light made the young horse's coat glow like honey as it moved awkwardly, still unsure of its surroundings. Hank knelt beside him with a brush, gently working through the matted mane. He wasn't expecting anything unusual. He only wanted the colt to feel a bit of care, a bit of safety. But as his fingers slipped through a thick knot near the base of the mane, something hard pressed against his thumb. Curious, he separated the tangled strands until a small metal pendant slipped free, dangling from a thin, weathered strip of leather. Hank lifted the pendant closer, brushing off the dirt. It was heavier than it looked, cool against his fingers even in the rising heat. Etched into the back was a symbol he recognized immediately, one he hadn't seen since his brief work years ago in a government-contracted mining project. A strange chill moved through him. He tightened his grip around the pendant, unsure why the sight of it stirred old memories he wished had stayed buried. As Buck nudged his shoulder softly, Hank realized this was no ordinary abandoned colt, and the pendant hidden in its mane was no accident. Whatever this little horse carried with him was going to change everything. The morning after discovering the pendant, Hank sat at the edge of his porch, staring out at the field where Buck now grazed, still a bit unsteady but clearly stronger than the day before. The pendant lay heavy in his shirt pocket, its strange weight reminding him that something was no longer ordinary about his quiet, worn-down life. He hadn't told anyone, not yet. Who would believe that a colt, bought for $15, had a government-stamped metal pendant tangled in its mane? He didn't even fully believe it himself. That afternoon, Hank loaded Buck gently into the trailer and drove down a winding country road toward a small workshop outside of town. Earl Whitaker, his old friend from their days working construction on federal projects, now spent his retirement restoring antique tools and collecting rare metals. If anyone could identify the pendant, it was Earl. As Hank pulled into the gravel driveway, Earl stepped out with a look of surprise. "Well, I'll be damned. That you, Hank? And what's this beauty you brought with you?" After some small talk, Hank placed the pendant on Earl's cluttered workbench. The old man leaned in, flipping down a magnifying visor over his eyes. His fingers moved with expert precision, tilting the object under the light. For a moment, there was only silence. Then Earl exhaled slowly, as if the air had turned heavier. "You know what this is?" he asked, not looking up. "This ain't no regular tag. This was used in classified inventory tracking, military black sites, maybe. And that mark there, that's Department of Energy. Early 2000s. He paused. Where the hell did you find this? Hank hesitated, then finally said, Caught in a knot of mane. On that colt. Earl blinked and looked toward the animal. Then you might have something way bigger than a stray horse, Hank. This pendant could be worth thousands, maybe more, depending on where it came from. And if it's what I think it is, there are people who'll want it back. The words landed with a weight Hank didn't expect. What had he brought home? And more importantly, who else might be looking for it? That night, Hank couldn't sleep. He lay in bed listening to the wind rustle the trees outside and the soft whinny of Buck in the corral. His thoughts spun in circles. Could the colt have been part of some secret experiment? Was he a stolen animal, or maybe even tagged by mistake? The possibilities were endless and none of them comforting. Every instinct told him to stay quiet, to protect Buck, and to keep that pendant far away from curious eyes. The next morning, Hank made a decision. He wouldn't involve the sheriff or any officials just yet. He needed time. Time to figure out where Buck had come from, and why this pendant was hidden in his mane like a message waiting to be found. But just as he stepped outside, he noticed something strange. Tire tracks in the dirt near the far edge of his fence. Fresh ones. Someone had been watching. Hank crouched near the tire tracks, running his hands slowly over the disturbed dirt. They were fresh, too fresh. No one had any reason to drive up that close to his property, especially not during the night. His ranch sat far off the main road, surrounded by nothing but pastures, fence lines, and silence. For someone to be that close without stopping by or calling out, it wasn't a good sign. A cold tightness formed in his chest. Whoever it was, they hadn't come by accident. Inside the barn, Buck stirred uneasily. The colt paced in slow circles, ears twitching, eyes darting toward the open door as if he sensed something too. Hank approached him, trying to soothe the animal with calm words and slow hands. But the unease wouldn't leave either of them. That pendant had stirred something. Maybe it wasn't just valuable, it was dangerous. And the idea of Buck being involved in something bigger than either of them was beginning to feel less like paranoia and more like fact. After securing Buck in the stall, Hank returned to the house and pulled out a worn leather-bound journal from the drawer beside his bed. It belonged to his late father, a man who had worked for decades in government logistics during the Cold War. Hank had barely glanced through it before, brushing it off as rambling stories from an old man. But now, maybe there was something in there that could help. Page after page, he skimmed entries filled with code names, obscure facility descriptions, and mentions of secure shipments in remote locations. Then one phrase made him freeze. Site 27A, classified transfer, metal tracking discs tagged to biological assets. He read it again. Biological assets. Tagged. Could that be what Buck was? Part of some decades-old experiment? Was he born into it, or taken and marked like equipment? His mind swirled with questions he couldn't answer. But one thing was becoming clear. This was no coincidence. The pendant, the symbol, Buck's odd behavior, and now someone sniffing around his land. This mystery ran deeper than he'd expected, and it was pulling him in faster than he could keep up. That evening, just before sunset, an old white SUV kicked up dust on the horizon. Hank's gut tightened as he stepped out onto the porch. But as the vehicle approached and parked near the fence, the driver's door opened to reveal a woman he hadn't seen in years, Clara Sullivan, his younger sister. Her presence was like a ghost walking out of the past. They hadn't spoken since their mother's funeral, nearly 10 years ago. She stood silently for a moment, holding a folder under her arm and looking older, but still sharp. "I heard about the colt," she said quietly. "And I know about the pendant." Hank stared at her, stunned. He hadn't told a soul. "How do you?" he started, but she cut him off. "You're not the only one being watched, Hank." The silence between Hank and Clara stretched long and tense as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting golden shadows across the yard. He hadn't expected to see her again, especially not like this. Her sudden appearance, paired with the ominous warning, sent a ripple of unease through him. Clara stepped closer, her boots crunching the gravel. "I didn't come here to argue," she said, her voice lower now. "But I need you to listen. That pendant you found, it's tied to something real. And it's not just military leftovers. People have gone missing because of it." Hank narrowed his eyes, torn between anger and confusion. "How do you know anything about this?" Clara opened the folder and handed him a photograph, an old, grainy image of what looked like a fenced compound deep in the woods. A timestamp at the bottom read 2004. In the center of the image, surrounded by men in hazmat suits, stood a horse. Young, golden-coated, its eyes hauntingly familiar. "They called it Project Sable," Clara explained. "It was supposed to be a genetic tracking study using animals, but it went off the rails. That colt you brought home, it may be the last piece of it." Hank took a step back, staring at the photo. "Are you saying Buck is some kind of experiment?" Clara nodded. Not in the sci-fi way. But yes, enhanced breeding, behavioral imprinting, and implanted tracking materials. The pendant was never meant to be found. And now that it is, others are going to come looking. Hank's jaw clenched. The fresh tire tracks by the fence made more sense now, and the weight of what he had taken in with that colt settled heavily on his shoulders. Suddenly, the low rumble of an engine echoed down the dirt road. A brown pickup truck approached slowly, deliberately. Hank motioned for Clara to get inside, but she stood firm. "That's the sheriff," she said, recognizing the truck. "He's not the enemy." Moments later, Sheriff Tom Dillard stepped out of the cab, tipping his hat. A heavy-set man with a weathered face and a no-nonsense presence, he walked straight to the porch. "Evenin', Hank." "Clara," he greeted, his tone careful. "Heard a few things that made me want to check in." Hank crossed his arms. "What kind of things?" The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Guy came through town askin' strange questions. Government type. Didn't leave a name, just showed a badge real quick and asked about livestock sales. Said he was tracking something unique." Hank's blood ran cold. He glanced at Clara, who gave him a look that confirmed what he already feared. Whoever was looking for Buck wasn't far, and they weren't going to knock politely next time. Sheriff Dillard took a step closer. "Now I don't know what's going on, but if this is something that puts you in danger, I need to know now. You got anything I should be worried about?" Hank looked down at the pendant in his hand, and then at Buck, watching them from the barn, like he somehow knew everything was about to change. Hank stared at the sheriff for a long moment, the weight of the pendant pressing against his palm like a loaded question. He wanted to deny it all, to say there was nothing unusual going on. But that would be a lie, and Sheriff Dillard had been a friend to the Sullivan family for years. Finally, Hank nodded slightly and opened his hand to show him the small, weathered tag. "I found this tangled in Buck's mane. Earl says it's government-issued, probably worth a fortune. Clara says it's connected to something called Project Sable." Sheriff Dillard squinted at the object, then looked up at Hank with a furrowed brow. "This thing's trouble," he muttered. "You should have come to me sooner." Clara stepped forward. "No offense, Tom, but not everyone in uniform can be trusted. If someone from that program is already sniffing around, then they're years ahead of us. They won't wait on protocol." Tom hesitated, clearly torn between duty and loyalty. "So what exactly are we dealing with here? A science experiment or a national security leak?" "No one knows yet," Clara answered. "But whatever it is, they're not looking for justice. They want it covered up." As the wind rustled the tall grass around them, The three stood in a triangle of silence, each one wrestling with what came next. Finally, Tom sighed and pulled out a folded paper from his breast pocket. "This came across my desk this morning. Anonymous tip claiming there's a marked animal on Sullivan's ranch. That's why I really came. If I got it, others will too." Hank felt the blood drain from his face. "They're trying to flush me out." Clara nodded. "They want you scared and confused so you make a mistake. That's when they'll move in." Sheriff Dillard looked back toward the barn where Buck still stood, calm but alert. "He doesn't look like a threat," the sheriff said softly. "But someone out there believes he's more than just a horse." Hank didn't reply. He didn't have to. Deep down, he was starting to believe it too. That night, Hank sat in the barn beside Buck, running a slow hand down the colt's neck. The stars outside were bright, but the air felt heavy. He thought of his father's journal, of Clara's photo, of the pendant, and of the men in suits who might already be watching from the woods. "You didn't ask for this," he whispered. "But somehow, it's all landed on you." Buck let out a quiet breath and leaned gently against him, a silent show of trust that meant more than any words. As Hank stood to head back inside, a faint sound made him stop. Leaves crunching. Movement beyond the fence line. He froze, his pulse thudding in his ears. In the darkness beyond the trees, something, or someone, was out there. Watching. Waiting. The following morning brought no peace. Hank barely slept, the image of shifting shadows at the edge of his property haunting his mind. He walked the fence line at dawn, shotgun slung across his back, scanning for footprints or signs of trespassers. There were faint impressions in the dirt, too light for a truck, too deep for deer. Someone had definitely been close. Again. Buck stood near the barn, unusually still, ears pricked forward. He was watching too. Inside the house, Clara sat at the kitchen table, going through her notes and a stack of old documents she'd brought. "We need help," she said without looking up. "We're in over our heads, Hank. Whatever this is, it goes beyond us." Hank rubbed the back of his neck, still trying to piece together the mess. "Help from who?" "The sheriff's already walking a tight line, and you said we can't trust the government." Clara met his eyes. "There's someone else. A journalist. Rachel Dillard. Tom's daughter." "Rachel!" Hank frowned. "She left town years ago." Clara nodded. "She's back. Working on investigative pieces about government mismanagement and military cover-ups. If anyone can dig deeper without tipping them off, it's her." Hank hesitated, conflicted. Involving more people meant more risk. But keeping it quiet hadn't worked either. "All right," he said finally. "Bring her in. But she talks to no one else." "Not yet." That afternoon, Rachel arrived in a dusty Jeep, her long brown hair pulled back, camera bag slung over her shoulder. She was sharp, quick to pick up on the tension, and didn't waste time. "So let me get this straight. You bought a horse and found a classified tag tangled in its mane?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Hank gave a curt nod. "That's the simple version." Rachel's expression grew more serious. "And you think this is tied to a black project? Because if you're right, someone's going to want that horse back. Badly." She spent hours examining the pendant, taking detailed photos, and recording Clara's account of Project Sable. Then, she asked to see Buck. The moment she stepped into the barn, something changed in her demeanor. "He's alert," she murmured. "More than most animals I've seen. He's watching us like he understands what we're saying." Hank had noticed that too. It wasn't just the way Buck listened, it was the way he responded, like he knew when to move, when to calm down, even when to hide. That night, Rachel stayed in town to begin researching the serial number etched into the pendant. Hank stood alone in the barn, Buck's soft breath steady beside him. But just before midnight, Buck jerked his head toward the door. Hank turned sharply, heart pounding. A faint red dot flickered across the barn wall. Then it vanished. Not a sound followed, but Hank knew what he saw. Someone had just marked their location. The red dot was gone in a blink, but its presence lingered like smoke in Hank's lungs. He moved slowly to the barn door, shotgun in hand, his eyes sweeping the dark fields beyond the fence line. The night was still, too still. No wind, no insects, just silence, heavy and watching. Buck stood behind him, muscles tense, ears twitching at every faint rustle. Hank knew enough to recognize a warning. Whoever had marked them hadn't come to scare. They were scouting, planning. By morning, Rachel was back, dark circles under her eyes and a stack of printed documents in her hands. "I found something," she said without waiting for coffee. "The serial number on the pendant doesn't show up in any public records, but it does match the formatting used by the DOE for classified environmental containment assets. This tag wasn't meant for tracking animals. It was meant for something hazardous." Clara's face went pale. Then what the hell was it doing wrapped in that horse's mane? Rachel spread out the papers across the table, revealing blurry blueprints and declassified facility layouts. One site kept popping up: Sand Ridge Complex, New Mexico. Shut down in 2009 after an internal audit exposed violations. Most records were destroyed, but a few survived. One mentions an off-book shipment marked for disposal, biological asset labeled Sable 3. Hank froze. That name again. Sable. And the number 3. Buck had a mark on his hind leg, a faint 3, barely visible unless you were looking for it. They sat in silence as the pieces began to fall into place. Buck wasn't just a stray or a forgotten experiment. He was part of something that had been buried, erased. And now someone was digging it back up. Rachel leaned forward, her voice steady but tense. If Buck really is Sable 3, then someone already knows he's here. They're watching, waiting. And if that red dot was what I think it was, they've already marked this place as a retrieval zone. Sheriff Dillard returned just before sunset, his expression grim. "I intercepted a transmission on an old frequency," he said, glancing around before entering. "Encrypted, military grade. All I could make out was asset confirmed, hold position. I think they're planning a night op." Hank felt his stomach twist. "So they're not just watching, they're coming." The sheriff nodded. "And they won't knock on the door, Hank. You need to move the horse." They scrambled into motion. Clara packed what she could. Rachel erased all digital traces of her photos and burned the copies. Sheriff Dillard mapped out back roads and old forest trails that would avoid surveillance. "I know someone who might help," he said quietly. "Name's Robert Green. Retired federal agent. Used to work in internal audits, real deep stuff. He's off the grid now, but I think he'll talk to me." As night fell, Hank led Buck into the trailer, the pendant wrapped tightly in a cloth, secured in his coat pocket. As the truck pulled out of the driveway, leaving behind the safety of the ranch, none of them noticed the unmarked black SUV parked just beyond the trees, engine still running, lights off, waiting. The road out of town was rough and narrow, winding through wooded backroads Hank hadn't driven in years. Sheriff Dillard led the way in his cruiser, followed closely by Hank's truck with Buck in the trailer. Clara and Rachel rode behind in Rachel's Jeep, scanning the woods with growing unease. Every passing mile felt like a countdown, each bend in the road a chance to be ambushed. They weren't just running. They were being hunted. After nearly 2 hours, the convoy arrived at a secluded cabin nestled deep in the forest. The place looked abandoned, but it wasn't. As they stepped out, an older man appeared on the porch, rifle slung casually over one shoulder. He wore flannel, faded jeans, and a sharp, assessing gaze. "Robert Greene?" Hank asked. The man nodded slowly. "You must be the stubborn cowboy Tom warned me about." His eyes shifted to the trailer. "That the asset?" Hank stiffened. "That's Buck." Inside the cabin, Greene lit a fire and gestured for them to sit. "I remember Project Sable," he said. "I helped shut it down. Or so I thought." He pulled a dusty folder from a hidden drawer beneath the floorboards and dropped it on the table. Sable 3 was the only subject never officially logged as disposed. He disappeared before the program ended. Some of us suspected he was smuggled out by a whistleblower, a scientist who couldn't bear to see what was coming. Greene paused, his voice lower now. That scientist was Elijah Boone. Hank looked up sharply. "Boone? I've heard that name before." Greene nodded. "Boone vanished the same year the site shut down. No one ever found him. But if Buck is Sable 3, it means Boone succeeded. He got the animal out, probably raised him in secret until something forced him to let go." Clara leaned forward. "We think Buck was abandoned recently. Maybe Boone was discovered." Greene didn't answer right away. Then he said, "If Boone's alive, he's running. If he's dead, others might be trying to clean up his mess." Rachel unfolded a satellite image she had printed earlier. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a clearing in a national forest just across the state line. "I traced Boone's last known location to a property he leased under a fake name. Aerial shots show signs of livestock, fencing, too much for a cabin, too little for a ranch. It could have been his hiding place." Greene studied the photo and nodded. "Then that's where you go next. But you can't wait. If the people watching you realize you've moved, they'll follow. And this time, they won't miss." The group agreed to split. Sheriff Dillard would return to town and lay a false trail. Rachel and Clara would head east to gather more records. Hank, with Greene riding shotgun, would take Buck across the border to the clearing marked on the map. As they prepared to leave, Greene pulled Hank aside. "There's one more thing," he said, handing over a weathered envelope. "Boone left this with me years ago. Said to give it to the man who showed up with the horse. Said he'd know when it was time." Inside was a photograph. A younger Buck, standing beside a girl. Written on the back, in Boone's handwriting, were the words, "Her name is Grace. If you find her, you'll find the truth." The forest road narrowed to little more than a dirt path as Hank's truck bounced over the uneven ground, Greene riding beside him with the map unfolded across his lap. Buck shuffled in the trailer behind them, oddly calm despite the tension in the air. They were nearing the edge of the property Boone had once leased, just beyond the state line. Thick pines crowded both sides of the road, casting long shadows that made it feel like dusk even at midday. Every sound, a cracking branch, a distant bird call, put Hank's nerves on edge. He wasn't sure what they would find, or who would be waiting. When they arrived, the clearing was almost exactly as the satellite image had shown. An old barn sat tilted to one side, its roof patched with tin sheets, and beside it, a small wooden cabin barely standing. Weeds had overtaken the yard, and the fencing was mostly down, but there were signs of recent activity. Footprints in the mud, and a fire pit with warm ash. Greene stepped out cautiously, scanning the perimeter with trained eyes. "Someone's still here," he said quietly. Hank reached into the truck for his rifle. He didn't want trouble, but he was ready for it. From the shadows near the cabin, a figure emerged. She looked to be in her early 30s, with dark, tired eyes and long hair pulled back beneath a dusty cap. In her arms, she held a small black notebook. "Don't shoot," she said, raising one hand slowly. "My name's Grace Boone." Hank's breath caught. The girl from the photograph. Greene lowered his weapon first, then Hank followed. "We're not here to hurt you," Hank said. "We're here because of Buck." At the mention of the horse, Grace's eyes softened, and she stepped closer. "You found him," she whispered. "You actually found him." She reached the trailer, and Buck whinnied softly. The moment she touched his neck, Buck let out a deep, relieved breath, like he recognized her instantly. Grace smiled faintly, tears brimming in her eyes. "My father died protecting him," she said, her voice trembling. "When they found out he had taken Sable 3, they came for us. He sent Buck away the night before they arrived. I never thought I'd see him again." Inside the cabin, Grace explained everything. Her father, Elijah Boone, had worked as a senior biologist on Project Sable. He grew disillusioned when the program shifted from animal tracking to behavioral modification and control, an unofficial step that crossed ethical lines. Buck had been one of the most promising test subjects, showing unusual intelligence and responsiveness. When Boone learned they were preparing to euthanize the animals, he risked everything to save just one. "He chose Buck," Grace said, looking at the colt through the window. "Because Buck chose him." As the sun began to set, Grace opened the black notebook, her father's final journal. Inside were coordinates, names, and detailed notes of everything that had happened behind closed doors. It wasn't just about Buck anymore. The files could expose everyone involved in the illegal expansion of the project. Green leaned over the table, jaw clenched. "If this gets out," he muttered, "they'll come for all of us." And then, from outside, a voice echoed, sharp and cold. "Step out with your hands up. Now." Red dots appeared on the cabin walls. The agents had found them. The red dots crept along the cabin walls like hunting spiders, moving slowly, methodically. Hank's heart pounded in his chest as he pulled Grace down behind the wooden table. Green grabbed the notebook and shoved it inside a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. "They won't find it here," he said. "But we don't have long." Outside, boots crunched on dry leaves. Voices barked orders, cold, clipped, military. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to erase. "Let me go out," Hank whispered. "They want the horse. Maybe I can buy us time." But Grace grabbed his arm. "They won't stop at Buck," she said. "They can't afford witnesses. If that notebook gets out, it'll bring down careers, maybe entire agencies." Her voice was trembling, but her eyes were resolute. "My father died trying to protect the truth. We can't let them bury it again." Green moved to the back window and pointed toward a shallow ravine that led down to the river. "There's a way out through the woods," he said. "I'll draw their attention at the front. You take Buck and Grace and run." Hank hesitated. "You'll never make it." Green just gave a faint smile. "I've made peace with that. I didn't spend my life exposing secrets just to die a coward." Before anyone could argue, he grabbed his rifle and kicked open the front door, drawing immediate fire as he shouted, "I'm the only one in here!" As the chaos exploded out front, Hank and Grace rushed to the trailer where Buck waited, stomping nervously. Hank unlatched the gate and led him into the woods, Grace holding tightly to the reins. Gunfire echoed behind them. Branches whipped at their faces, but they didn't stop. Not until the cabin was long behind them and the trees opened to a wide clearing near the river. There, hidden in the underbrush, was a second vehicle, a rusted old truck Elijah had left years ago, untouched but operable. Green had known it would be here. They loaded Buck carefully into the bed, tying him down gently with ropes and padding. Grace climbed into the passenger seat, clutching a copy of one final page from her father's journal, one that Green had given her before the ambush. "We take this to the press," she said. "Full exposure. No middlemen, no hesitation." Hank nodded, staring down the road ahead. "You sure you're ready for what comes after?" Grace looked out the window at Buck, who stood calmly in the back, as if he'd always known this day would come. "We don't run anymore," she said. "We finish what he started." 2 weeks later, The journal's contents went public through an independent news outlet. Names, locations, evidence. Project Sable wasn't just a rumor, it was real, and the world finally knew. Government officials denied everything, of course, but the pressure mounted. Investigations opened. Careers ended. And deep in the hills of northern Colorado, on a quiet stretch of land gifted by a foundation for animal rehabilitation, Buck now lived freely. No wires, no tracking, no secrets. Hank visited often, standing by the fence while Buck trotted across the pasture, mane glistening in the sun. Grace ran the sanctuary now, and every time she looked at Buck, she saw not just a survivor, but a promise kept. A life reclaimed. A secret set free.